I'll be very brief. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. As Lonnie said, my name is Stephen Salel, and I'm working at the Honolulu Museum of Art. Tomorrow, our museum will be opening the second installment in our multi-year exploration of Japanese manga. The exhibition that is entitled The Disasters of Peace, Social Discontent in the Manga of Tsuge Tadao and Katsumata Susumu will continue until April 15th, 2018. So you have a while to catch it, hopefully during your winter break or whenever you can. The Disasters of Peace features work by two artists who were involved in a form of mature, socially conscious manga known as gekiga, literally dramatic pictures. And like other artists in that genre, they exhibited their work in a monthly anthology called Garo. In order to avoid saying things that Ryan will cover, I'll just say that there is only one scholar in the world who is focusing his research on the topic of gekiga and Garo, to my knowledge at least, and that is our guest speaker, Dr. Ryan Hohenberg. After receiving his PhD at Yale in the Department of Art History in 2007, where he wrote a dissertation about the history of Garo, he later revised that text and published it 3 years later as Garo Manga, the First Decade, 1964 to 1973. He has recently been in residence at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Art and Culture, and he is currently a visiting associate professor at the University of Tokyo. In addition to his frequent contributions to the Comics Journal, Art Forum International, and Art in America, Ryan is active as both an editor and a translator, working on a number of works, some of which we have on display back here and which are part of the library's collection. Let me single out Trash Market, a work by Tsuge Tadao that was published in 2015 by Drawn and Quarterly. Ryan has two important publications that will be published in the coming months. Slum Wolf, which is another collection of Tsuge Tadao's work in English, and Fukushima Devil Fish, which features the work of Katsumata Susumu, and which will be published by Breakdown Press this coming March. If you're free, Ryan has a few other presentations in the coming days. On Thursday, that's tomorrow, from 5:30 to 7 o'clock at the Honolulu Museum of Art School, room 101. He'll be talking about the Garo and the birth of alternative manga. And also on Friday, again at the Honolulu Museum of Art School, he will be giving a presentation that lasts exactly 6 minutes and 40 seconds on the topic of early Japanese comics and their American influence. This evening's talk is Fukushima Devil Fish, Katsumata Susumu's Antinuclear Manga. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Hohenberg.
Thank you for having me to the university, to the museum, especially thank you to Stephen for getting in touch with me a year and a half ago to organize the exhibition and then the events around it. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be here and to share this material with you. As Stephen kind of mentioned, this presentation is linked to some research I've been doing over the past 2 years, or more likely about a year ago, that I have to kind of revive and revise now, about the career of a manga artist named Katsumata Susumu, who has been getting more and more attention in Japan of late, especially since the meltdowns in 2011 for his work from the 1980s and 70s on nuclear energy in Japan, but also for some literary manga that have nothing to do with nuclear energy or any kind of disaster scenarios, also receiving a number of prizes in Japan in the past couple of years. Now, what's interesting for me about Katsumata Susumu is that he kind of offers a different category that's very common within comic book studies, which is atomic comics. As you know, many superheroes are formed in the crucible of radioactivity. And in Japan, of course, Hiroshima Nagasaki casts a long shadow over all facets of post-World War II Japanese culture, including manga. And what always interested me, I was living in Japan at the time of the meltdown, and I've been living in Japan off and on since, more on than off, is that especially with the protests that followed the disaster, and then a lot of writing in English about the disaster, also in Japanese, that you oftentimes saw the coupling of Hiroshima and Fukushima. No more Hiroshima, no more Fukushima. And in some ways this is a sensible connection, but for me, and having, even before I started researching the back history of nuclear power in Japan, it seemed to me that this obfuscated quite a bit, which is a 40 or 50-year history of Japan actively pursuing nuclear power, really without regard to the legacy of Hiroshima in many cases. But just to kind of talk about atomic comics, usually when people talk about atomic comics in Japan, manga is represented by Nakazawa Keiji, who himself was a hibakusha. He was a child in Hiroshima at the time. He started publishing very political, very anti-American, kind of B-grade pulp comics in the late 1960s, criticizing the ABCC and American lack of culpability or taking of responsibility of the bombings. And then in the early 1970s, he started writing more autobiographical work. The first of which, it was something called Ore wa Mita. I saw it in the early 1970s, which subsequently came out as, I believe it's the first translated manga into English. It came out in 1982. And also, regardless of superheroes with superpowers created by atomic energy or irradiation, you also had, during the age of active atmospheric hydrogen bomb testing, many comics in which that was also being a theme. Now, there's also kind of an underappreciated history of anti-nuclear power comics in the United States. And one of the things that's interesting about this object on the left is that it's published by a publisher called EduComics. And EduComics was founded by a man named Leonard Dreyfus, who lives now in Seattle. He was living at the time in San Francisco. He was part of the underground comics movement that was initiated by R. Crumb and Zapp in the late 1960s. In the late 1970s, he starts doing self-published comics under EduComics on various kind of political and historical topics about the American Revolution, the Constitution, about food politics. And he also did this, All Atomic Comics, in 1976, which is a very detailed and very informative diatribe against the American nuclear power industry. It went through a number of print runs in the United States. It was also translated into German twice because the anti-nuclear movements in Germany were really taking off in the late 1970s. This is before 3 Mile Island, 1976. After 3 Mile Island in 1979, of course, much more attention is paid to nuclear power in a critical fashion in the United States. So you even have places like Marvel Comics picking up not so much on TMI on 3 Mile Island as the protests north of Los Angeles at the Diablo Canyon reactor. So here you have She-Hulk in the Thing stopping, I can't remember what his name is, some guy who's, I think he was fired or something by the plant, and he decides to wreak vengeance upon the plant by demolishing it and irradiating all of Southern California, right? So you have this kind of a category I like to call, after like sexploitation, nukesploitation comics, which you have quite a few also in Japan, and I'll show you some. Now, of course, in Japan, when you talk about nuclear-powered superheroes, first comes to mind is Tetsuan Atomu. He runs on a combination of computer microchips, computer processing, and he has a small nuclear reactor which fuels him. In the manga itself, nuclear energy, from what I have seen, is not a huge issue. However, even after Atomu was retired, he comes out of a kind of an era in Japanese culture in which nuclear energy was still the future. The first nuclear power plant in Japan doesn't go online until 1966. So in the 1950s, when Atomu was created, it's still kind of a dream, truly a dream technology. No one really knows how it will manifest and the problems that manifest around it. But after Atomu is kind of retired as a manga and animation serial in the late 1960s, after the next wave of nuclear power reactors start going online in the early 1970s, the Japanese nuclear power industry has tons of money from the government and from the utilities, and they start creating a lot of propaganda for newspapers, and also they start targeting children very heavily. I think they realized that with the various pollution issues that were happening in Japan, and a lot of skepticism about kind of the dreams of industrialization in Japan by the late 60s and early 70s, that they were going to have to target the next generation of Japanese. So they aggressively start pursuing children and start hiring top cartoonists. Matsumoto Reiji, who you might know as Space Battleship Yamato, he becomes kind of party to this in the 1990s. But in the 1970s, Tezuka's studio produces a number of manga. This is a children's book in quasi-manga form, meaning it doesn't really have any panel breakdowns, but it has speech balloons about the animals of the African jungle. They're suffering from some kind of new ice age. They want Africa to be warm again, so they need some kind of superpower energy to warm the entirety of Africa, which is a really frightening idea now with global warming. So one of the jungle animals, who of course come from Jungle Emperor, this is a famous manga from the 50s and animation from the 60s. They know Atomu, of course, because they have links with Tezuka. So they send a party to Japan to get some education at, I think it's Genshiroku Daigaku, Atomic Energy University in Japan, led by Atomu's creator, Ochanomizu Sensei, and Astro Boy. Atomu goes back to Africa with the animals, carrying a nuclear power reactor on his head. They create the reactor. They hook up to the reactor these Jinko Taiyo, these artificial suns that warm Africa, and all the animals are happy again. And there's a really scary episode in it where there's an earthquake, because everyone thinks that it's an earthquake in Japan, you shouldn't make reactors, the reactors will fall apart. And this is something you typically see in children's pro-nuclear propaganda in the 70s, and that is kind of the counter argument, not run away from the reactor, but the reactor is the best built building in the area. So in the case of a tsunami or an earthquake, run towards the reactor, because that's where you'll be safe. That appears in this comic in a number of ones. In the end, all the jungle animals are happy, and nuclear power saves the day. Now, the nuclear industry is also doing more covert things in the biggest manga and youth publications at the time. Shonen Magazine, you might know. It was at this time, before Shonen Jump outran it, around this time or soon thereafter, was the weekly manga magazine with the highest print run. I'm guessing around this time is around 3 million per week. Very high level content, but occasionally you'll have content in it that is such that suggests that someone bought page space to commission it because it's fairly low-grade material in terms of entertainment value. One of them that kind of anti-nuclear critics picked up on was this thing you see on the left, which is Tokyo Daiichi, the Great Tokyo Blackout. This appeared in 1978, 1 year after the New York blackout. And the premise is that you have TEPCO, Tokyo Power Electric Company. This is a guy who works at the company. There's a blackout for various reasons. It's a super hot summer day. Everyone's using air conditioning. So some freak accidents occur where the coal-fired plants have to shut down. A lightning storm happens. The power lines fall out. Tokyo plummets into a blackout. There's car accidents. People are suffocating inside. Pregnant women are suffocating inside elevators. Everything. And finally, the Tokyo Electric TEPCO salaryman comes to the rescue and finds a way to go and re-rig the grid so that electricity is back on. And it never names nuclear energy, but there's a message at the end that basically Japan needs to find more reliable energy sources. And reliable in this era meant not depending on foreign oil, but also something that could be expanded very fast. And in that era, in the 1970s, that meant nuclear energy. So you had a kind of a covert manga that wasn't naming nuclear energy, but creating a kind of a culture of fear and dissatisfaction around Japan's existing energy infrastructure. Now, also in Gekiga magazines for young men, you also had, by the late mid-1970s, the appearance of anti-nuclear power movements, which started taking off in this moment, especially in the countryside. Also making its way into kind of sexploitation, nukesploitation comics at the time. The first such example and most interesting and exciting example is this work by an artist who's probably not well known outside of Japan, but who's well known to Gekiga fans in Japan, named Miya Kazuhiko. He started off in the 70s doing critiques of American bases, of issues like Minamata, pollution issues, usually in exploitation format. And then in 1976, he spends a summer in Mie Prefecture, in southern Mie Prefecture. And southern Mie Prefecture at the time was fighting and successfully fought the creation of a nuclear power plant a little bit south of Ise area. So what this story is that some fishermen will not sell the rights to their land or to the sea to the nuclear power industry. The nuclear power industry and their lackeys in the local prefectural government hire Yakuza to off the rest of the fishermen. So they kill, she and her husband are the last holdouts. She's a diver for pearls. They come, they kill him. They think they also drown her, but she rises back up from the dead and then spends the last 200 pages of the serial harpooning Yakuza with a harpoon, and oftentimes diving in and out of the water in a highly suggestive and sexual fashion. So already, and at this point, you also have a number of filmmakers starting to make manga about, not maybe about or with nuclear power in the background. And it's interesting that this artist uses a female protagonist, given the fact that, especially in the Japanese countryside, the anti-nuclear power movement was largely led by women. Part of the reason is that a lot of men were on dekasegi, so they would not have been in the countryside. They were in cities working, but also people have argued that women in the countryside were less satisfied with a one-time payout from industry to sell fishing rights and land rights, whereas women were more interested in kind of protecting the land for their children, for grandchildren, and for generations to come. Now, kind of an interesting figure in this is Katsumata Susumu, and his background I'll talk about a little bit later. But he's interesting because while volume-wise, he didn't create the greatest number of pages on anti-nuclear power issues or pro-nuclear power issues prior to Fukushima. He did create the widest array of material, and includes story manga, so a couple 30-page stories, one of which is featured in the museum in the show at Honolulu. He also created a large number of 4-panel strips for a magazine called Fujin Minshu Shimbun, which was a Japanese Communist Party related feminist weekly newspaper, which later on broke ties with the Communist Party. But they hired him as a cartoonist in the late 70s and 80s to write cartoons on a number of topics. He stayed with them for about 15 years, and probably 1/5, maybe over 100 of the 4-panel strips deal with nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And it kind of gives a very local view of kind of the range of what nuclear power issues meant to Japan. It wasn't just about Hiroshima or Fukushima, right? There's a whole range of issues that are captured in his work, and I'll show some examples at the end. When I got into this, fell into this topic kind of by accident. I was planning on doing a very basic collection of Katsumata Susumu's anti-nuclear manga with a very basic essay. So the manga would have been about 150 pages, and my essay was supposed to be about 5,000 words. It ended up becoming 60,000 words. And so the book had to split, and it's a long story, but it's basically going to be at least 2 publications now. This is not the cover, but this book from Breakdown Press, which will include some of the manga and some non-nuclear manga, will be out probably in March. And then I'm currently revising a manuscript called No Nukes for Dinner, how one cartoonist, referring to Katsumata and his country, learned to distrust the atom. Now the book that's coming out from Breakdown Press is a straight-up translation, well, not straight up, there's some added material, of a book that came out in 2011 in Japan. Even though it includes manga from the 1970s and 1980s, the book itself was published after 2011. And for me, one of the interesting things about kind of the outpouring, the cultural outpouring that came after the meltdowns in 2011 was also kind of the archive opened up. That if you were attentive, you learned a lot about the history of nuclear power in Japan. You also learned about a lot of artists who had been forgotten. That there was this image that Japan had one of the smallest and weakest anti-nuclear power movements, and that may be the case relative to places like the United States or Germany. But if you look at the documentation and you also look at the cultural responses, it seems like in Japan, at least in manga, there's the largest number and largest variety of anti-nuclear power cultural responses prior to Fukushima than in any other country, right? Now, one of the distinctive things about anti-nuclear literature and visual culture in Japan is that there's quite a large amount of material on the men who worked in the nuclear power plants, not in the control room, but who were hired as maintenance workers during periodic inspections and shutdowns at nuclear power plants. They've gone by a number of names. One is hibaku rodosha, so irradiated laborers. Another one's more descriptive, shitaoke rodosha, so subcontracted laborers. And the subcontracting refers to the fact that they weren't direct employees of the utilities, but oftentimes hired by small subsidiaries that often have a number of yakuza middlemen who were kind of skimming off of hazard pay and daily wages. The first kind of exposés that you have in Japan in the late 1970s, prior to 3 Mile Island, trying to out the nuclear power industry and its advertising of being kind of the perfect industry for energy production in the future, were actually books about the labor system at the plants. There's a couple of, one was written by, I can't remember his name, Mori something or other. He used to work at the plant, and then he wrote kind of a diary of kind of the dirty conditions at the plant. And then someone named Higuchi Kunio wrote a book. He was a journalist who started working at the plant and then wrote about his experiences. But this is also the case since the meltdowns. Maybe a number of you have seen this manga, which was translated into English this past year. Tatsuta Kazuto, who is kind of a no-name manga artist, using a pen name here. He was hard up for work, so he got a job as a cleanup worker at Daiichi in, I believe, 2013 or 12 is when he first went. And he was there for 2 or 3 stints, and he wrote about 600 pages worth of kind of a comics reportage about what was going on at the nuclear power, at the cleanups at Fukushima Daiichi. Not at all critical of the industry, focusing very specifically on kind of ground details of what's happening during the cleanup. But part of the reason I show this is to say that there's this, although this is kind of kind of lauded as a kind of a new manga, a kind of a new approach to manga making in the disaster when it was published after 2011. It also has a history in the sense that, like I said before, that there's a large amount of literature in Japan focusing specifically on nuclear power laborers. And the most famous book used another name, Genpatsu Gypsy, here meaning nuclear power plant gypsies, a name meant to signify these workers' marginal status in terms of Japanese society, but also the fact that they didn't have a secured work, that after a month or a few weeks at a plant, after the inspection period was over or after they had exceeded their radiation doses for that year, they were either shifted off to a new plant or they had to wait the year until their radiation doses were back under the allowable rate. Right? So this is a famous book that kind of broke things open in 1979. Also in the late 1970s, the first visual images of inside nuclear power plants, not produced by the industry, started to be published. The best known photographer, photojournalist, who stuck with nuclear power issues even to the present is named Higuchi Kenji. Higuchi Kenji, first exhibition and book was about Yokkaichi, about the pollution and asthma cases at the petrochemical estate in Mie Prefecture in Yokkaichi. Then he starts doing a number of other photo books about things like disabled veterans, about coal miners, about Okunoshima in Hiroshima Prefecture, which was the site of a gas weapons plant during World War II, right? And about the afflictions that its workers were still suffering in the post-war period. So Higuchi, like a lot of the people who were involved in writing this kind of material, were really interested in kind of laborers that didn't fit the model of kind of Japan as number one, right? Not white-collar laborers, but subcontracted laborers who were not supported by the system. So he gets access after many tries inside a nuclear power plant. These were shot at Tsuruga, north of Kyoto in Fukui Prefecture in 1977. And these images had a huge impact, not just on how people thought about nuclear power, but also on more creative expressions about nuclear power. One of the first manga, or perhaps maybe the first manga depiction of these Hibaku Rodosha, irradiated laborers, was actually done by Mizuki Shigeru, who you might know as the author of Kitaro, the famous yokai ghost hunter hero, a popular children's comic since the 1960s. Because of Mizuki's fame, also because of his experiences, his career of depicting the kind of the supernatural and creepy, he was hired by Asahi Graph, I think. Asahi Graph in 1979 to illustrate a short story by Horie Kunio, who did the Genpatsu Gypsy book, about a worker who was at the Fukushima Daiichi plant who eventually committed suicide. He eventually committed suicide. Actually, I'll get to that in a second. But it focuses mainly on work conditions in the plant. And even though it's based on Horie Kunio's work, which was on the site reporting, Mizuki took a lot of liberties in terms of how he represented the interior of nuclear power plants. So 1979, also the year of 3 Mile Island, but also the year that Alien was released. So in this, on the left, that image of, first of all, you don't see any stacks like this in Japanese power plants on top left. And this image of the frightened laborer, this actually comes from a PR pamphlet of the China Syndrome, the movie with Jane Fonda and Michael Douglas, right? So he's appropriating from kind of a general culture. And these images, I don't have the image here, but these pipe images come from Higuchi Kenji's photographs. However, if you imagine H.R. Geiger's depictions of the interior of the alien spaceship, there's also that impact, right? And when he's showing the kind of labor they do, he heavily exaggerates. Here, a couple laborers are inside the containment, sucking out contaminated goop so that the reactor will function well. Now, this book was reprinted. It was a two-part series in a tabloid meaning, I'm talking about the format, not the content, photojournal in 1979. It was published as a small book after the meltdowns in 2011, but they censored or eliminated or didn't include, without any comment, one image, which was the first image of the original series. And this image shows a laborer having hung himself on a tree. This is actually a report from a contemporary report, and they think that the reason that he hung himself, I can't remember the details, if he left a suicide note or what, but recently his girlfriend had left him, and they believe that the reason that his girlfriend had left him is because she wanted to have kids, but she was worried about, because he works in a radioactive environment, what kind of genetic damage that would be for their offspring, right? So you have these stories of kind of the difficulties, not necessarily just about being in danger because of radiation exposure, but also kind of the culture of discrimination that has existed historically in Japan around those who are inflicted with radioactive exposure. But after 2011, for reasons that I don't know, when this was republished, they decided that this was too sensitive of an image, even though the man's story is talked about. Now, Katsumata Susumu also starts his career as an anti-nuclear cartoonist slightly before, but around this time. His most work is actually not a work of manga, though it is kind of a work of cartooning and text. There's this book called Genpatsu wa Naze Kwaii ka? Why Nuclear Power is Scary. It was first published in 1980 by Kobunken. And if you know what Kobunken is, they are a left-leaning publisher that specializes in books for high school students and young adults. They issued this book in 1980. It went through an expanded reprint after Chernobyl, and then was reprinted again, still in print now after the Fukushima Daiichi facility. If you read kind of old, it was made for high school students, but if you read old reportage about anti-nuclear movements in the countryside, you'll sometimes see this book cited as the first and sometimes the only book that farmer and fishermen are reading to kind of get a different version than what the industry was feeding them through various types of PR events. So in that sense, Katsumata, who is credited as the illustrator, but according to his wife, he died a few years ago, according to his wife, Katsumata also wrote most of the book. And the reason he was able to do this, I'll explain later, is because he had a degree in nuclear physics. So this was released to be kind of in the biggest kind of anti-nuclear handbook back in the 1980s. It's mainly text, but he does a number of illustrations for it also. The first page is actually the Fukushima Daiichi facility, which already by the 1970s was fairly notorious as a dirty and dangerous place. Here with a mushroom cloud behind it and the waves in the foreground. And then he does a number of illustrations illustrating such things as bioaccumulation of radionuclides, even though that maybe what's coming out normally on a normal day is a low amount of radiation that through ecological processes becomes a significant amount, and also how waste storage, nuclear waste storage, which still hasn't been solved in Japan, was also using very faulty material. Now there is this short 2-page manga format illustration inside the book, which is interesting because it's 2 pages by from Horie Kunio's Genpatsu Gypsies, and what this 2 pages show is not necessarily radiation and how nuclear power is inhuman because of its size and its lack of safety mechanisms, but how in the design of nuclear power facilities and reactors that the industry really didn't think about maintenance or humans whatsoever. And now this is showing, what it's showing here is, moving from top right, is that one worker, he has to take a piss while he's inside the containment. He has to run out, he has to take off his anti-C wear, right, which takes a long time. He has to go through, has to check his various dosimeters to see how much radiation he's been exposed. If he has too much, he has to wash off and then go back through it. Then it's showing the different layers. It's showing how far it is from where he was working to the shawashitsu, the shower room, right? Then going through various things, and he has to wait in line to get to the shower. And finally, he finds a drain in which he can piss, right? So there's many ways that people were talking about the inhumanity of nuclear power. Katsumata thought it was interesting, as Horie did, that this kind of inhumanity of the nuclear power industry can be found at a very kind of local and trivial level, in the sense that power plants weren't designed with people in mind, that even though they had to be cleaned and maintained and people had to work inside them, that the way that it was structured, not only because of radiation, but how things were designed or not designed, made it such that even small activities, necessary activities like relieving yourself, weren't mapped into the design, right? Now, not only was Katsumata reading literature at the time, he also did site visits. He took a bunch of snapshots. Very interestingly, he visited in 1984 the Fukushima Daiichi facility, and then another facility, which is about 10 kilometers south of the Daiichi facility, the Fukushima Daini facility, on one trip. And they're interesting photographs, not only because now we think of Fukushima Daiichi facility as a site of horror, but also you get to see, in 1984, someone with credentials like Katsumata Susumu, who was obviously connected to the anti-nuclear power movement. You get to see how far in he was allowed by the industry at the time. That the thinking at that time of the industry was, if they're enemies, let them in and we'll convince them otherwise, right? So here you have a shot of the facilities. Now they don't have these kind of coverings, the blue and white speckled ones that became famous after 2011. That's the original containment. Here you have guards at the gate. He was allowed as far into where workers were passing out after work, getting their radiation checks and changing. Some of the more interesting, scary photographs are actually at the Fukushima Daini plant. And I think it's oftentimes forgotten that the Fukushima Daini plant was also inundated by tsunami. And there was quite a fear that, I think maybe someone here knows better than I do, but I believe that the Fukushima Daini plant, its power also went out for a short time. But here's an interesting photograph, and it tells you very clearly how little the Japanese nuclear industry thought about tsunami safety in the 1980s. So this is the seawall blocking the plant. You can see how high it is, which is not very high at all. I think subsequently in the 90s they raised this about 3 times. But this is the idea of anti-tsunami protection. What you have here, these 3 boxes, are the intakes for the seawater, the pumps to the intake seawater to cool the reactors. This is the turbine building that generates the electricity, and these are where the reactors are, right? So you can see that no protection, and the first things that knocked out are the mechanisms for bringing in water to keep things cool, right? So you have things like this. He was also allowed this far into the plant, into kind of the forest of pipes. Here you kind of see, how hard it is to maneuver a human body. You can imagine if you actually have to fix things inside here, how difficult that is. And then signage like this, obviously he focused on this signage, ochiruna, otosuna. And ochiruna means, this is basically the idea of safety for the nuclear power industry at the time. Otosuna means don't drop it. In this case, don't drop any pipes, don't drop any tools, because if you drop them, you'll damage them, and that costs a lot of money. And ochiruna is referring to the workers. Don't fall, not because if you fall, you'll get hurt, but if you get hurt, it means we have to report it to the Japanese government, which means a lot of money and probably bad publicity. So stay safe and stay healthy, not for your own benefit, but mainly for the benefit of maintaining the image of total safety and perfect labor safety record inside the plant, right? Now, Katsumata used this material, and including to some of his other research, to make a number of 2 story manga in the mid-1980s. The one that's exhibited at the Honolulu Museum of Art was the first one. I think you have about, 10 pages? Yeah. 10 pages of a work called Deep Sea Fish, Shinkaigyo, that was published in a magazine called Comic Baku, which was kind of a torchbearer of Garo in the early 1980s. It only lasted 3 or 4 years. This story begins a nice spring day. You have kind of fuzoku here, right? A strip joint, obviously for the male workers at the plant in the area. Traffic into the plant. It's not named as a Fukushima Daiichi. It's called, I think, like Soma, Genshiroku Hatsudensho. So Soma being the area just north of Fukushima Daiichi. So essentially this is set at Fukushima Daiichi, right? They talk about their daily life. This guy, he can't find housing, so he's staying at the local love hotel, right? Then they get their jobs for the day. You can see that this is related to that photograph earlier. Kind of a detailed account of what is involved in getting in and out of the plant for a laborer. And then kind of these images showing what work was like inside the reactor. Again, you can see that this is from a photograph that he took. About low-level radiation, gaga, of course, is a Geiger counter crying. And then how do you depict kind of the menial quality of the laborer, but also how do you depict the fact of being attacked by invisible radiation. Here you have why the Geiger counter is singing. You have this man with small dots starting to accumulate on him like pox, right? And this is kind of more than the irradiation episode. This is the episode that I think is most powerful. You have this older worker who is not allowed outside of the plant until he gets his radiation count down to a certain level. And the problem is that while he was working, he cut his finger, and radiation has got into his wound. So he has to use a wire brush in the open wound and get out the particles. So the Japanese is really great, right? Buddy, 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 right? It's the sound of iron wires against this, and the blood's flying out, right? So this process, and then finally they get outside for a lunch break. This guy has the afternoon out. This is the guy who stays at Love Hotel because he's already had his daily doses of radiation. So he gets the day off, the rest of the day off. They ask him what he's doing. He says, I'm going to pick up a chick and have some fun. They say, yeah, right. Eventually, the manga ends with him actually at his hotel with a chick, but only virtually. He's spent the afternoon watching porn on his TV and then fallen asleep. And then that last image is very nice. You have these marks on the back, which double as, triple as, there's 3 things. One as hickeys, imagine hickeys from his session of Imagine Lovemaking, right? And then also perhaps, what do you call it? Spots from being exposed to radiation, obviously an exaggeration of what would actually manifest under those kind of work conditions. And then also probably flower petals, cherry blossom petals, signifying kind of passing of youth, all kind of mapped onto this guy's back in kind of a layering of different visual symbols. Now Katsumata, the second work, is not in the show, is also about nuclear power plant laborers. And I won't go into synopsis, but I just want to say that what's interesting about it is it's called Devilfish. The other work is called Deep Sea Fish. Another distinctive thing about Japanese nuclear visual culture is the plethora of marine metaphors. Some of this has to do with the fact that just, Japan is by the sea and has a close relationship with the sea, but also unlike in the United States, where almost most nuclear power plants are built on lakes or especially on rivers. In Japan, they're all built on the sea, on the Pacific Ocean, and on the Japan Sea side. So there's a relationship with the sea there. Obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have the current situation. But also, you have this guy talking about how it's so quiet, especially in this outfit. It's so muffled that it's like being at the bottom of the ocean. Right? It's very scary. It's very lonely. But also in this story, the side story is that this octopus gets stuck in one of the seawater intakes, and they have to flush him out. And these guys say that being a worker is like being an octopus. Being a nuclear worker is like being an octopus because it's like killing yourself. I guess octopi, when they're stressed, eat their own limbs. I didn't know this. But there's also some other, I think, metaphors going on here. For those of you who know a little bit about Japanese labor history, there's something called takobeya, right? Octopus rooms. And they were kind of these small contained rooms in which you locked laborers in so that they would work harder and they couldn't get out. So it was like bad living conditions for workers. And also, if you read, I came across this recently, there's someone named Kamata Satoshi, who is a well-known journalist. He wrote an expose about Toyota in the 1970s. It was translated as Japan in the Passing Lane. There's also a number of marine metaphors there. Apparently, like working inside the Toyota factory on the line was like working at the bottom of the sea even there. So there's some complicated things going on here in terms of marine metaphors and kind of the language used for labor. Now, what I want to just finish with, I have a lot of material, but I'm just going to look at a little bit, is why did Katsumata come to write this material, right? Because he did not approach it as a subject matter that was alien to him. It wasn't just a subject matter for integrating his backdrop into an exploitation action comic, but it was something very personal to him. And that is because he had an undergrad degree in physics and a master's degree in nuclear physics, which he received in the early 1970s. Now, there's a lot of writing about the campus struggles in Japan in the late 1960s, about how higher education and even high school education was essentially shut down by anti-Vietnam protests and protests about how Japanese universities were run, corruption scandals, etc. One of the things that's often not talked about is that some of the biggest struggles, the protests, were actually about issues about the Japanese university's connection to developing big science, industrialized science in Japan. And Katsumata was actually at the center of this. So Katsumata started off he debuted in Garo in 1966 while he was a student, a college student. And he started off writing 4 panel strips and then took off in the early 1970s doing stories starring Kappa. He himself is from Ishinomaki in Tohoku. He grew up on a farm. He spent his childhood leading cows around grazing and make sure they got back at night. But he started doing comics in the early 1970s that kind of take the, Kappa, Tanuki, these kind of classical mythological creatures, and look at them as if they actually existed, but also how they would be subject to processes of modernization in the Japanese countryside. Typically, the Kappa are kind of like dekasegi workers left behind. They're men who cannot, non-men, who cannot travel to the city to make a living, so they're kind of live subdued and poor lives in the countryside and result to violence because of boredom and other reasons. So he does this kind of work. But what he was best known for and first popular for was his 4 panel strips on various social and political issues, sometimes dealing with the campus struggles. And here you can see a lot of the Garo artists were picked up in the mainstream press, at least briefly in the late 1960s and early 70s. And here you see an article in the Mainichi Shimbun from 1969. As you see, the Japanese Genshikaku Butsuligakushi ga manga egaitara. So if a nuclear physics graduate drew manga, ... And this is an era in which a lot of magazines since the 1960s were really interested in kind of curious about this image of Japanese university students, which was on a mass scale a new thing in Japan, spending their time not reading Marx and Kant, but reading manga in their free time. So you had lots of essays in the mid-60s and late 60s about that. And of course, this takes it another level up. Not only do you have college students reading manga, but you have a nuclear physics graduate student who's supposed to be the elite of Japanese education, spending his free time drawing this frivolous thing called manga, right? Now, so this is kind of images of what was kind of classic images of what was going on at universities in the late 1960s, political infighting between hard left groups, barricading of universities. But as I said, something that's often forgotten is the connections between big science and the campus protests in the late 1960s. This is fairly well documented for the American case. There's lots of writing about how professors and students at various universities, especially at MIT, were inspired by the Vietnam War and opposing combinations of kind of military and academic collaborations and research on universities. Something like this was also happening on Japanese university. One of the big issues was something that happened, I think, in 1966, where it came out that a number of Japanese universities and the leading physics academic society had been receiving money from the American military to conduct studies about how to combat tropical diseases. And of course, this is an era during the Vietnam War, so how to combat tropical diseases had very direct application to how the United States was conducting itself globally. So there's a lot of protests about that. Also, Yamamoto Yoshitaka, who is probably the most recognizable leader of the campus stroke in the late 1960s. He too was a graduate student in nuclear physics, right? And here you have a tatekanban, a standing sideboard, about how Japanese university researchers needed to think more about what their research was going towards. There was no such thing as pure research, that if you were conducting research, even if you knew that your own research wasn't directly going into different types of military applications or problematic industrial applications, that you were part of a system and needed to think about that more in detail. This is at Tokyo University. Now, Katsumata Susumu was at a place called Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku, which functionally doesn't exist anymore. It's now Tsukuba Daigaku. But in Tsukuba Daigaku was also at the Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku was also at the center of this. It was split up a number of campuses. The campus that had the science department where Katsumata was close to Todai. It's in Otsuka. There's a Tsukuba Daigaku campus there now. But it was at the center of things because the Japanese government wanted to create a kind of all science research university. And so they picked a university out of the national university system. They picked Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku because, as I said, it was split up between multiple campuses. The university was already thinking about how to integrate and maybe move outside of the university. So the government hopped on that and wanted to basically liquidate all of the non-science departments and move the main facility, the main university out to Tsukuba, which is like, 100 kilometers north of Tokyo? So there's that. Students were really opposed to it. They were opposed to this idea that science and humanities education should be split, that scientists also needed to think about those kind of issues. It was also interested in Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku because one of its most esteemed faculty, and for a time the university president, was Tomonaga Shinichiro, who won the Nobel Prize in 1965 alongside Richard Feynman and, what's his name, Julius Schweisinger? I can't remember what his name is, for quantum electrodynamics. So they basically wanted to scoop out this elite physics department and move it to Tsukuba. And of course, at this time, the main reason they want to focus on physics and nuclear physics is, of course, because the nuclear industry is fast expanding at this time in Japan in the 1960s. Now, Tomonaga Shinichiro was a participant at the first Pugwash symposium in the late 1970s, which is against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. He wins the Nobel Prize in 1965. Also on campus at Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku, there was a number of student pugwash conferences and non-proliferation kind of groups and conferences on campus. So it was this kind of anti-proliferation culture at Tokyo University of Education. And even Katsumata Susumu, even though he does very few nuclear comics at this time, some of his earliest comics you can see are influenced by this culture at Tokyo Kyoiku Daigaku. So here is two of his earliest cartoons for Garo from 1966. Here you have Japanese school children making an A-bomb, of course written in English, in Romaji, right, called Preschool Stupidification. What was the Japanese? I can't remember what it was. But, so you have this, and then you have another cartoon about the splintering of the anti-nuclear weapons movement in Japan based on kind of left-wing political differences in the 1960s. He also does a large number of cartoons about this campus struggles. A small number of them deal with science education on campus and how it's kind of an impoverished and politically problematic system. So cartoons like this, where you have a professor lecturing in front of a chalkboard full of equations. Looks like he's talking to them about something smart, but then they come out to the end, he goes, so Audrey Hepburn got divorced? Not yet, right? So you have this setting of high education and they're just gossiping about lowest kind of things. And this one's good too. So this student's been giving a tour of the university. This is the library. Wow, so big. This is the laboratory, impressive. This is the lecture hall, spacious. Anyway, congratulations on graduating, right? And then you have some cartoons which are dealing with the fact that people were concerned. We have one here about, radiation. This, I think, is the only one where this guy says that if you expose plants, that they will, grow more healthily, and you'll be able to feed 3 times as many people. And then this boy comes out with 3 times as many heads. And then there's a number of cartoons dealing with, as I said before, the infiltration of American military money into Japanese science research. Here's one, a doctor talking about why this experimental subject rabbit has died. They say, that's strange, we just bought this machine. How could he die just from this? The equipment is brand new. Maybe because we bought it with American military money. So the idea that American military money being research for war making, that it obviously that it causes death on its subjects. And here's another one. The janitor, he peeks over a guy's researcher's shoulder. He says, "I bet that's American military research." He says, "No way, get out of here." And then he stands on the equipment to see what actually he saw. Right? Let's see. And then a number of cartoons about how students were forcing elderly faculty to think more critically about what the purposes of their research was, and there's no idea of pure research. Here one is the researcher is locked in his office, and he has to go to the bathroom. He's told to basically swallow it, and he has to, of course, swallow it out of a scientific beaker. Let's see what else is there. And then things like this that happened in the late 60s and early 70s. Basically, when the campus struggle was broken apart by increased police activity. Here you have a high school student at a university taking the entrance exam. Right, the riot police come in, scribble over his test, and then walk out laughing. Right, or this is one of the last ones that Katsumata did on this topic. Here you have new students being shown various facilities on campus. Right, this is the chemistry lab, electronics department, but of course a tour of campus means very carefully circumnavigating the political activities that are going on outside. Right. Now Katsumata quits his PhD in 1971. He says because he doesn't have the money, but if you think about, he knew also that nuclear physics research, the most likely job he had for him was in the nuclear industry, and so he quits in 1971, same year that Fukushima Daiichi I believe it's the third plant, goes online. So he's kind of a defector from this industry. And I'm going to stop here, but I just want to give you a preview of the other kind of material that he made. As I said, the great bulk of his work was in something called Fujin Minshu Shimbun, which was founded by a group called Fujin Minshu Club, which was active since the late 40s and 50s in the anti-nuclear protests inspired by the Lucky Dragon incidents. And then in the 1980s and 90s, they did a large number of features specifically about, from a feminist perspective, about how local farmers and fisherwomen were combating the expansion of nuclear power in the Japanese countryside, right? Genpatsu wa tomerareru onna no power tsunago, right? And then also about how so-called housewives in the city were also doing a lot of protests against electricity bills going up supposedly because of increased building of nuclear power reactors. And Katsumata does a large number of cartoons, not at all from a feminist perspective, but a large number of cartoons about various issues. And as I said before, they're very interesting. I ended up, most of them I didn't know what they were about. And the more you look at them, you realize there's tons of micro-histories of nuclear issues in Japan that aren't even represented by knowing the main nuclear power plants. There's a number of cartoons about 3 Mile Island, about radiated marine life, about different ways that Japanese scientists, this refers to kind of a project in the mid-1970s where a certain type of flower, which was highly sensitive to even low levels of radiation, went from blue to pink, even if it was exposed from a small amount of radiation. Activists planted these plants around nuclear power facilities, and they turned color, is to show that some radiation was escaping. A number of cartoons about the labor system. Also things that aren't really known, which is that Japan tried aggressively to get rid of its nuclear waste in the 1980s by dumping it in the Pacific Ocean, following the lead of England and America and other countries. And then a lot of the countries in the Pacific formed the Nuclear-Free Pacific movement and opposed this. So you have a number of cartoons in which representatives of the Japanese nuclear industry or the government are basically being mobbed and thrown in the ocean by these men, right? And also how Nakasone is using ODA, Overseas Development Aid, as a kind of exchange to get rid of its nuclear waste, etc. A lot of cartoons about Chernobyl, about the proliferation of weapons and Japan's position as a kind of a nuclear weapons base in the Pacific for the United States, etc. So I'm going to stop there. As I said, eventually this project will probably result in actually 3 publications. One will be Fukushima Devilfish, a collection of manga about nuclear power and non-nuclear power story manga, which should be out in March. My book manuscript, which I don't know when it will be out or finished, maybe 2 years, I don't know, 1 year. And then also orphaned in the breakup of this project were the 160 cartoons that Katsumata drew about nuclear power. I don't know how I'm going to publish these. I might have to self-publish these eventually. I mean, they're of interest historically, but there's no market on the comics market for this kind of material. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, thank you for listening, and hope it was of interest.